Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Reader's Workshop. It's been a while, but I'm excited to see you. Let's make sure before we get started that we're ready to learn. So eyes watching, ears listening, quiet as a mouse, and still like a pretzel. Today we are going to review what we already know about story elements, which is something that we talked about at the very beginning of the year. And we're also going to learn about a special kind of story called a folk tale. This is one of my favorite parts of the year. So a long time ago, we learned about characters, and we learned a whole bunch of things about characters. So we're going to quickly review a little bit about characters. So we learned that characters can be people, animals, or things. We learned they can talk. Here you see Cinderella talking. She's part of our folktale unit. We learned that characters are who the story is about. Here's Little Red Riding Hood. She's another folktale legend. We learned that characters can change. And we learned that we can make connections to characters. Okay? They might remind us of something in our own life. They might remind us of something that we read in another book, or just something that we know about the world. We learned that characters can have external traits and internal traits. The external is what we can see on the outside just by looking at them. The internal traits are what the characters are thinking or feeling, and we can learn about their internal traits by their actions or their thoughts. So here's Cinderella as an example. We know her external traits. She had blonde hair. She's a woman. She's thin, right? And she has got blue eyes. I can tell that just by looking at her. Because I've read a lot of different stories about Cinderella, I also know that she was, I know some of her internal traits, what she was like on the inside. I know she was kind and hardworking. I know she was sad, but I also knew she was a dreamer. Okay, so the next story element that we talked about is the setting. Hopefully you remember seeing this poster hanging up in your classroom. The setting was the time and the place when a story happened. Okay, the time and the place. Sunny day in the cottage. Different stories have different settings. So here you have Little Red Riding Hood taking place in the woods. And here you have Cinderella taking place in a castle. We learn that we can figure out the setting by looking at the illustrations. And we learned that they can change. So here's Little Red Riding Hood again. First she was at her own house, then she was going through the woods, and then she was finally at her grandma's house. Okay, one last part to review from the old days when we were so young is the central message of the book. Remember, that was the book's big idea. We called it the light bulb moment because that was when we figured out what the author wanted us to remember most. Okay, what the author wants us to remember most. So now we're going to learn a few things about the type of book that we're going to read next, which is folktales. The first thing that I want you to know about folktales is that they are an oral tradition, which means they are passed down through generations through oral storytelling. Okay, so before there were books invented, before there was even paper, so long ago, people would gather around a storyteller and the storyteller would tell a folktale. Okay, so when you see folktales in books now in the library, you'll see that instead of saying written by, they'll say retold by, because they weren't the original person that wrote the book. They're just retelling it in their own way. Okay. The second thing that I want you to know about folktales is that they are made up to teach lessons. Okay? The author definitely wants you to remember something. Okay? Or, oh, and you can't even see the nice little rainbow there. Okay, folktales also attempt to explain the wonders of nature. So we just learned about how rainbows happen, but before there was science explaining how rainbows happen, people would make up stories to try to explain these wondrous things that they were seeing in the world. And then the last thing that I want you to remember about folktales is that different folktales are told all over the world. But many cultures have their own version of the same folktale. So right now, I'm going to get my head out of the way. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories, and they all look very different. But these are all versions of Cinderella. And this is just 6 of them. Okay, there's so many versions of Cinderella. Okay, so depending on where you are in the world, that would be the version that you would read. Okay, so there's here in the middle is where it says folktales, and you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 different kinds of folktales that kind of all fit underneath this idea of folktales. We're going to talk about these 3 kinds in the next few weeks: fairy tales, fables, and pourquoi tales. But we're going to get into the individual characteristics of those types of books a little later. Okay, not today. So remember, you can read a folk tale just like we do. We've got 2 versions of the Goldilocks and the 3 Bears right here. And, oh no, we don't. I'm sorry. This is Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, and this is the 3 Little Pigs. And remember, folktales were originally told orally, which means through the mouth. They teach us a lesson or attempt to explain nature. And they are different all around the world. All right, my friends, happy reading. I will see you next time.